Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. It all started one summer afternoon when four close friends, David, Michael, Sarah, and John, decided to leave the city for a long camping trip. They had known each other since college and had often organized short trips, but this time they wanted something different. A deep forest, located nearly 50 miles away from town, was mentioned by the locals as a quiet place, but also associated with many strange rumors. It was this mystery that made the group curious and chose this place as their destination. David was the one who proposed the idea. He has always loved nature and believed that the deep forest would bring the tranquility that the group needed after months of stressful work. Sarah was a little more worried. She often read creepy stories online about trips that never returned. But then Michael's smile and John's excitement made her nod in agreement. The four quickly prepared tents, flashlights, and food to begin the seemingly simple trip. It began to get dark as they went deeper into the forest. The trail narrowed and disappeared, leaving only rows of tall trees surrounding them. The unusually cold air made Sarah shiver. The wind blew through the leaves, creating whispering sounds. Michael laughed loudly and said it was just the wind, but there was a hint of tension in his eyes. John was interested, so he videotaped the dark scenes so he could share it later as a homemade horror movie. When the group stopped by the stream to set up a campfire, they realized how quiet the forest was. There were no bird songs, no familiar insects, only the sound of running water. David tried to dispel the atmosphere by telling horror stories he had read. His voice was warm, but in the flickering firelight, his face became more frightening than usual. Sarah covered her ears and forced a smile, saying she didn't want to hear these things right in the forest. But the rest of the group was still excited and asked for more. Night fell faster than they expected. Darkness swallowed everything, leaving only a small glow from the fire. They sat close together, feeling as if surrounded by an invisible force. Suddenly, a strange sound rang out from afar. The sound of slow footsteps stepping on dry leaves was clearly someone or something. Michael immediately stood up, holding a flashlight to shine in the direction of the sound. But the light only shone into the clearing. A feeling of fear began to creep in. Sarah held David's hand tightly, whispering that maybe they shouldn't be here. John was now calmer, thinking that it was just a wild animal. However, just a few minutes later, the footsteps appeared again, this time closer and clearer. No one in the group dared to speak. The wind stopped blowing, the air seemed to freeze. The fire flickered and then suddenly went out, leaving the darkness. The four friends panicked and turned on their flashlights, but the dim light only illuminated a few meters in front of them. In the silence, they heard a soft laugh from the woods. A faint sound that made their skin crawl. Sarah burst into tears, and David shouted out to ask who was there. There was no answer, just a laugh that repeated and then faded into the wind. Michael tried to reassure everyone that it was probably someone playing a prank, but his voice was shaking. John was starting to feel uneasy and suggested that the group pack up and leave that night. But the woods were so deep and dark that the path had disappeared, and turning back was out of the question. They were forced to stay until morning. At least the four of them huddled in the tent, listening to every strange sound around them. The rustling of leaves sounded like someone was walking around the camp. Soft sighs could be heard just outside. Sarah couldn't sleep. She looked out the crack in the tent and swore she saw a figure standing between the trees. But when Michael shined his flashlight outside, there was nothing. The atmosphere became more oppressive than ever. The first night passed in fear. They stayed up until dawn. But when the sun rose, the group realized that strange footprints surrounded the camp. They did not look like animal footprints, nor did they look like human footprints. Long, distorted shapes were imprinted on the wet ground, as if something not of this world had been right next to them all night. David was speechless. Michael turned pale. John lost his confidence, and Sarah fell to her knees, sobbing. The group understood that this camping trip would not be as normal as they had thought. Dawn broke, but instead of feeling safe, the group felt even heavier. The distorted footprints on the ground that could not be explained made everyone shocked. David knelt down and touched the wet footprints, and said in a choked voice that there was no way this was human. Michael tried to smile but could not hide his pale face. He said it was probably a joke by someone who lived nearby, but all four knew that this forest was dozens of miles away from any houses. No one would come here in the middle of the night to joke around. Sarah hugged John's arm, her eyes red from a sleepless night. She whispered that she heard someone calling her name in the night. John shook his head, but then he suddenly remembered that when he was sitting in the tent, he also heard a whisper, very soft like a wind blowing, but each word was clear. At that time, he thought he was imagining it. But now, everything seemed to prove that there was an invisible presence around them. The group decided to pack up camp quickly. David said that they should leave here before it got dark again. But when they tried to find the old path again, they realized that there was no trace of the previous trail. All they could see was the towering tree trunks, one after another, endlessly. The map no longer made sense, and Michael's compass was spinning as if some kind of magnetic field was acting on it. Sarah was getting more and more panicked, screaming that they were trapped. John held her back, but he couldn't deny the feeling of fear that was tightening in his chest. That afternoon, the group decided to stop by an empty lot to rest and discuss. While David lit a fire to cook some food, Sarah sat silently staring into space. Suddenly, she jumped up and pointed into the forest in the distance. The three of them turned around and saw a blurry figure standing among the trees. The figure was unusually tall, not quite human. When Michael turned on the flashlight to see more clearly, the figure disappeared immediately as if it had never existed. They looked at each other, their faces drained of color. John decided to take a camera and record everything. He said that if anything happened, at least he would leave evidence. But deep down he knew he was shaking. David told everyone to stay close together. He said he had read ghost stories about people lost in the woods and heard the voices of their dead loved ones. They were led deeper and deeper until they disappeared forever. Sarah immediately covered her ears and begged him not to tell her more. But what was happening made it impossible for them to just consider this a scary story. As the afternoon wore on, the darkness enveloped the woods again. At that moment, the group heard giggling coming from many directions. No one saw anyone, but the sound seemed to be lingering right next to their ears. Sarah crouched down, holding her head and screaming, covering her ears. David rushed to hug her to calm her down, but his eyes were also darting around. Michael shouted into the void for someone to appear, but the only response was deathly silence. Then a terrifying scream echoed as if coming from the ground itself, causing them all to fall to their knees. John trembled and said that something was teasing them. He remembered the moment the figure disappeared during the day, and now this laughter continued as if it wanted to drag them somewhere. They decided to go back to the stream, hoping to find a way back. But when they got there, they only saw the dry stream bed with sharp rocks. The strange thing was that last night they could clearly hear the sound of running water. It was as if the surrounding scenery was changing in an inexplicable way. The second night fell quickly, and this time it was even more frightening. The wind blew strongly, with whispers echoing as if dozens of people were talking right around the camp. Every time David stepped out to turn on the light, all the sounds stopped, but when he returned, they echoed more clearly. Sarah lay exhausted in the tent, shivering and praying continuously. Michael sat quietly, clutching the pocket knife in his hand. John did not leave the camera. He whispered that if this was the last time they needed to leave something behind. When the clock struck midnight, the campfire suddenly flared up fiercely, as if someone had poured more oil. The red light illuminated the strange shadows dancing around them. Sarah screamed as she saw the figure of a woman in tattered clothes standing behind the trees, staring. But when the group looked together, all that remained was a dark void. The whispers now became clear words, calling out each person's name. Michael threw a rock into the darkness, but the laughter in return froze the group. They knew they were not alone in this forest. No one slept that night. The calls of the shadows and the unnatural cold continued to surround them. When the first rays of morning light appeared, they looked at each other with tired eyes and extreme fear. No one said it out loud, but they all knew this trip was out of control. And deep down, they realized that this forest held a secret that humans should not discover. The morning of the third day was gloomy, with grey clouds covering the sky, making the whole forest seem to be covered in a layer of mist. The group could no longer maintain optimism. Sarah's dark eyes were clearly visible because she had cried all night. Michael quietly packed up his things, but his hands were shaking. David held the compass, but the needle kept spinning as if he had lost control. John held the camera tightly, not taking his eyes off the surrounding trees, as if he was afraid that even a moment of distraction would cause that creepy shadow to appear again. They decided to try to follow the dim light of the sun, hoping to find a way out. But the deeper they went, the denser the trees became, and the darkness became more and more overwhelming. The sound of footsteps echoed out of sync with their steps. At one point, Michael stopped, but he still heard footsteps right behind him. He turned around, but there was nothing but a dense space. Sarah clung to David's arm, tears welling up in her eyes, whispering that someone was following them. When they reached a large open space, the group finally breathed a sigh of relief. But the relief didn't last long. There were strange symbols drawn on the ground in a circle of earth and stones. In the middle was a pile of black ash, like the remains of an old fire. John took out his camera to record while David exclaimed that someone had been here and was clearly performing unusual rituals. Michael frowned, feeling the space heavier than ever. Sarah shivered, clutching her chest, whispering that she heard a soft singing voice in the wind. The singing sounded like a woman's voice, near and far, causing the group to freeze. They looked around but saw no one. Suddenly, the wind picked up, making the trees sway and make a screeching sound. The sky darkened. The only light left was from Michael's flashlight. In that moment, John shouted that he saw a figure standing right at the edge of the circle. They all turned around, but all they saw was a dark void. Sarah sobbed, and David pulled the group away from the place as fast as he could. They ran in the forest until they were exhausted. When they stopped, they realized they were back in the same clearing with the strange circle. It was as if the forest was teasing them, bringing them back to the same place, not wanting to give them a way out. John threw the camera to the ground, angrily shouting that they were trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Michael held his head and said that they needed to calm down, but his voice was broken with despair. Sarah almost fainted in David's arms, mumbling and begging for her to leave this place. The third night fell quickly. They set up a makeshift tent, but no one dared to sleep. The whispering echoed around them again, but this time much clearer. Voices repeated each person's name over and over. Sarah covered her ears, but she could still hear. Michael was shaking with the knife. John tried to film the scene with the camera, as if to prove he wasn't crazy. David held Sarah's hand tightly, but his eyes kept glancing around, hoping to catch the person behind this evil act. In the middle of the night, as the fire was dying, a tall, dark figure appeared at the edge of the light. No one dared to move. The shadow stood still for a few seconds, then slowly retreated into the forest, disappearing without a sound. Immediately after, a giggle rang out everywhere, causing everyone to fall over each other. Sarah screamed until her voice was hoarse, and Michael threw the knife away in panic. David quickly ran to pick up the knife and pulled the group into the tent. Closing it tightly. Inside the tent, they heard footsteps walking around slowly and heavily. Occasionally, there was a light tapping sound on the tent fabric, making their hearts want to explode. John held the camera out to the small crack, trying to record, but there was only thick darkness. Sarah trembled and whispered that there were eyes looking at her through the crack. Michael grabbed the flashlight and shone it out, but still nothing. The fear had now surpassed the limit of human endurance. When the sky was light, they dared to stick their heads out. Around the tent, there were countless handprints on the damp ground and on the tent fabric. The hands were long and crooked, as if they did not belong to humans. David stepped back, his face pale, and Sarah collapsed to the ground. Michael tried to pull her up, but his own legs were weak. John took in the whole scene with a broken voice, unable to keep his composure. The group knew that what they were facing was inexplicable. This was no ordinary camping trip, but a fight for survival in the middle of a haunted forest. As the morning light shone down, the dew still lingered on the leaves, but no one in the group felt at peace. Around the tent were deformed handprints with unusually long fingers imprinted on the wet ground, as if dozens of creatures had surrounded them all night. Sarah sat motionless with her eyes lifeless, and David tried to pull her up, but her legs were shaking and wouldn't budge. Michael looked at the handprints and then turned to John and said, "We have to leave now, otherwise we'll definitely not have another chance." John quietly turned the camera back on, his eyes blank. He whispered that all this evidence was proof of the scary stories that people had told about this forest. Sarah clung tightly to David's arm, tears falling down her face. She begged him to find a way out. David nodded, but in his eyes, the determination seemed to be wavering. He never thought that the relaxing camping trip would turn into a real nightmare. The group started walking in the direction they thought would lead them out of the forest, but there was no sign of them getting closer. The trees were getting thicker and the sunlight was blocked out, leaving only a pale blue light. Michael angrily threw the map to the ground, saying that it was all for nothing. Sarah kept hearing her name being called from afar. She held her head and screamed that everyone else could hear it too. But David and John could only hear the wind whistling through the leaves. The tension in the air was so intense that they almost argued, if not for a strange sound, the sound, like a metallic bell, echoed through the forest. It was loud and gloomy, causing the group to stop and listen. John reflexively raised his camera, while Michael gritted his teeth and raised his knife. The sound gradually became clearer, as if it was luring them to follow. David reluctantly suggested going closer to find the source, as if someone was there, they might be able to find help. But deep down, everyone knew it could be a trap. When they reached another clearing, everyone was stunned. In the middle of the clearing was an old wooden post with torn cloths and strange symbols carved into it hanging from it. Sarah screamed when she saw the dry red streaks around the post. Michael quickly pulled her back, but he shivered too. John panned the camera around and exclaimed that this was definitely where someone had performed a ritual. David took a deep breath, but the pungent smell made him choke, like the smell of something burning that could not be named suddenly. From the edge of the forest came a steady drum-like beat. Sarah trembled and fell while John turned his head and panned the camera into the darkness. In the mist, they saw a figure standing motionless. The tall, thin figure had its arms hanging down and its head tilted to one side, as if observing. Michael shouted loudly for it to come out, but the only response was a twisted laugh. David grabbed everyone and pulled them away quickly, but the footsteps behind them were clearly heard, as if something was chasing them. They ran aimlessly, their hearts pounding, their breaths ragged. When they stopped, they all realized they were back in the same empty space with the strange wooden pillar. It was as if the forest was spinning around, bringing them back to where it wanted them. Sarah cried out in despair. Michael smashed the map in his hand, and John panned his camera everywhere, muttering that there was no way out. David clenched his knife in his hand and said in a trembling voice that maybe this forest was really cursed. The fourth night fell colder than ever. The fire they had started kept dying, as if someone had deliberately put it out. In the thick darkness, soft sighs echoed around the tent. Every time someone moved, footsteps responded. Sarah hugged David tightly, her eyes closed. Michael sat motionless, his hand clutching his knife. John continued to film each moment, when suddenly his camera showed a clear silhouette behind David. He screamed, but when he turned around, there was nothing. The shadow just appeared on the screen and then disappeared. The group was in a panic all night. They understood that they were no longer dealing with imagination, but with something real in the forest. The strange signs, the whispers of the shadow, and the disappearance of the path all combined into a single truth. This forest would not let them leave, and it wanted them to be a part of it. The fourth night ended in a heavy silence. As the dim morning light filtered through the foliage, no one in the group had the strength to talk. Everyone's eyes were dark and their limbs were limp. Sarah lay motionless, her lips dry and cracked, muttering prayers. David tried to help her up, but he himself was shaking and could no longer maintain his usual calm. Michael sat with his knees drawn up, staring into the forest in front of him as if waiting for something to appear. John turned on the camera again and whispered that if anyone found this tape, they would know what we had been through. They decided to try to continue, hoping to escape the evil cycle of the forest. But only a few hundred meters later, the group returned to the same wooden post with the strange ritual circle. Sarah burst into tears and collapsed to the ground, saying that the forest was playing with them. David hugged her and tried to calm her down, but his desperate eyes betrayed the fear in his heart. Michael threw the knife to the ground and roared that he could not bear it anymore. His roar echoed through the forest, and suddenly a voice answered. It was a deep, hoarse, distorted male voice that seemed to come from underground. The group froze, listening to each word vaguely but surely calling out each person's name. John panned the camera to follow. The echo, but the screen was filled with thick darkness. Sarah held her head and screamed that the voice was right in her mind. Michael trembled, picked up the knife, and swore that if anything appeared, he would fight back. David pulled everyone into a corner and sat close together, trying to stay awake. But the voice did not stop. It echoed everywhere, sometimes far, sometimes near, sometimes right in their ears, sometimes deep in the forest. Every time they thought it was gone, it echoed louder, driving them crazy. As the afternoon wore on, the air became more stifling. The wind stopped, the birds were still absent, and there was only an eerie silence. Sarah whispered that she saw a woman in a long dress standing between the wooden pillars. The three turned around, but there was nothing. However, a strange, pungent smell spread out, making them nauseous. John turned back to the wooden post and swore that in the lens he saw the woman's shadow hovering around. When he lowered the camera, the figure disappeared. Michael snatched the camera from John's hand and turned it over and over again. But the screen was blank. As night fell, the sky was moonless and starless. The forest was plunged into absolute darkness. The group lit a fire, but the fire flickered as if it was about to go out. In the silence, a child's sobbing suddenly sounded. Sarah almost fainted in David's arms. Michael shouted to ask who was there, but the crying only grew closer and closer. John trembled as he panned the camera around the camp, and this time, in the lens, he clearly saw a child standing next to the wooden post facing them. Its face was obscured by the darkness. Only its white eyes were shining. He shouted, causing the group to turn around, but the child had disappeared, leaving only a cackling laugh in the distance. They huddled together in the tent, trembling. The sound of small footsteps running around, accompanied by the laughter of children, drove everyone crazy. Sarah cried and begged to be let go. David held her tightly, his eyes red. Michael held the knife in his hand, and John kept whispering that this couldn't be real. In their desperation, they heard someone whispering right next to the tent. A high-pitched voice repeated the words "Stay with us" over and over again. The tent flapped, as if someone was pressing it from the outside. Everyone froze. No one dared to move. That night, they couldn't sleep. When dawn came, there were still tiny, distorted footprints around the tent, like those of a deformed child. Sarah fainted in David's arms, and Michael vomited. John sat staring blankly at the scene before him, then mechanically panned the camera. The group knew that this forest was not only inhabited by ghosts, but also by other spirits. And now they had their eyes on the 4 unfortunate people who dared to set foot in their territory. The next morning dawned with no consolation. Tiny, misshapen footprints were still imprinted around the tent, a reminder that they had been noticed. Sarah lay down, exhausted, her face still wet with tears. David sat beside her, holding her hand as if clinging to a fragile hope. Michael quietly sharpened his knife while John sat motionless, staring blankly into the camera lens. No one spoke to each other, but they all knew they were no longer invisible intruders, but the real targets of the forest. As they continued to move, hoping to find an escape, the air around them became thicker and thicker. Every path seemed to twist back to the same point. Each footstep echoed, as if dozens of others were following. Sarah clung to David, and John whispered that he heard his name being called from behind. When he turned around, he saw a child's silhouette standing silently in the distance for a few meters, then disappearing as if into the mist. Michael immediately shouted for everyone to run faster, but the forest seemed to be closed in, with no way out. Noon, they accidentally found an old wooden hut hidden in the middle of the forest. It was rotten and mossy, but clearly someone had lived in it. David hesitated and then pushed the door open. Inside was dark and had a strong, musty smell. There were ancient symbols on the walls. Sarah covered her mouth when she saw an old cradle lying in the corner of the room, covered in ash but still had small handprints. John panned the camera and his voice was broken when he said this was evidence of the true scary stories that people told about children disappearing without a trace in the forest. Michael opened a wooden chest and found inside full of torn rag dolls. The doll's head was torn off and the eyes were sewn back with coarse thread. He threw it on the ground and shivered. Sarah sobbed and said she heard children laughing right next to her. David hugged her tightly and yelled at her to leave the hut immediately. But as soon as they turned around, the door of the hut slammed shut, startling all four of them, screaming loudly. In the thick darkness, the sound of a child's cry echoed throughout the room, then turned into giggles. John panned the camera around and found small figures moving around them. But when he lowered the camera, there was nothing. Michael shouted and banged on the door, trying to open it, but to no avail. Invisible hands were pounding on the wooden wall, creating a pounding sound. Sarah collapsed, holding her head and begging, while David tried to stay calm and pull everyone together. Suddenly, a strong force threw the main door open, and the group rushed out into the dim light of the forest. They ran as fast as they could, not daring to look back. When they stopped to catch their breath, they found themselves standing beside a still lake. The water was as smooth as a mirror, reflecting their pale faces. Sarah approached, startled because, instead of seeing her own image in the water, she saw the face of a strange child with white eyes staring at her. She screamed and fell back into David's arms. Michael shined his flashlight into the lake, but the water only reflected a shimmering light. John panned the camera, and the child's face was still clearly visible in the lens, making him tremble and almost drop the camera. They ran away from the lake, but the air around them grew colder and colder. Their breaths were white, even though it wasn't winter. Whispers followed the laughter of children. Sarah kept repeating that an invisible hand was grabbing her shirt. David held her tightly, pulling her away, while Michael pointed his knife in all directions. John ran and filmed, whispering that everything was trying to keep us here forever. When night fell, they set up a small camp, but the fire couldn't burn long, flickering for a few minutes before going out. In the darkness, they heard a lullaby, an ancient song. Sarah trembled, holding her head, and David choked out, saying that they had no chance of escape. Michael silently clenched his knife in his hand. John panned the camera into the distance, but this time there were no figures, but dozens of white eyes staring at them in the woods. The camera shook violently as he screamed and Sarah cried. That night became one of the most terrifying they had ever experienced. That night the forest seemed to have turned into an invisible prison. The white eyes that glittered in the darkness never left them for a second. Sarah sat trembling in David's arms, her face pale as if there was no more life left. Michael kept swinging the knife around the camp as if he would attack if a shadow approached. John still held the camera tightly, his hands shaking but still recording. Sighs echoed around them as if there were dozens of souls lingering around the small fire they had lit was extinguished in just a few minutes. Darkness swallowed everything, leaving only the faint light from the flashlight. But that light did not bring safety. On the contrary, it only made the darkness around them more terrifying. Each time the light swung back and forth, it seemed to reveal distorted shapes hidden behind the trees. Sarah screamed as she saw a woman's face appear in the foliage. But when everyone turned round, there was nothing but cold air. A sudden, terrifying screech rang out in the silence, making the group's hair stand on end. It was not like an animal, but like metal scraping against stone. Michael gritted his teeth and shouted into the darkness, demanding to be seen, but the only response was a shrill laugh. Sarah collapsed and cowered while David held her tight. John panned the camera and swore that he saw dozens of figures standing at the edge of the camp. But when he lowered the camera, they disappeared as if they had never existed. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching out like a century. They didn't dare sleep, staring into the darkness with their eyes wide open. Every time the wind blew through the foliage, a whisper called out each person's name. Sarah sobbed and said she heard her long-dead mother's voice. David panicked and held her tight, refusing to let her go. Michael screamed that they were being lured into a trap. John whispered that the haunted stories he had heard were all real and they were living in it when the clock struck midnight. The entire forest suddenly fell into absolute silence. Even the sound of the wind disappeared. The four held their breaths and waited. Then a slow, steady sound of footsteps sounded as if someone was approaching them. The flashlight beam was aimed but only shone into the empty space. The footsteps stopped right next to the tent, causing Sarah to scream. The tent fabric fluttered as if an invisible hand was pressing on it. Michael rushed out and swung his knife into the empty space, but only hit nothing. Immediately, a laugh echoed throughout the place, causing the group to freeze. Suddenly, a tall figure appeared from within the forest. It had no face, just a pitch-black void. The figure stood still, then slowly raised its head, emitting a creepy growl. John panned the camera, his whole body trembling. Sarah fainted in David's arms. Michael rushed forward to attack, but as soon as he swung his knife, the figure vanished into black smoke and appeared behind him. He turned back and shouted, causing everyone to panic. David pulled Sarah into the tent, while John trembled and begged for mercy. The footsteps continued to circle around them all night. Each time the light passed, only a glimpse of the disappearing figures could be seen. By the time the first light of dawn appeared, everyone was exhausted. They sat on the ground, panting, but the fear had not subsided. Michael clutched his knife, his eyes bloodshot. John hugged the camera to his chest, clinging. Sarah woke up sobbing, and David whispered that if they did not find a way out soon, they would not have a chance. And deep down, each of them knew that the forest had chosen them not to let them go, but to keep them forever. The dim morning light filtered through the trees, but instead of bringing hope, it only made the forest more eerie. David helped Sarah walk heavily. Michael went ahead, cutting branches to clear a path, while John followed behind, filming everything with his camera. No one said a word because the silence seemed to increase the fear. As they went deeper, they suddenly saw an old, dilapidated wooden hut nestled in the middle of the clearing. The door was slightly open. The wind blew through, making a creaking sound that sounded like it was moaning. Michael looked around, then turned to everyone. He said that if anyone had lived here, they might find food or a clue to escape. Sarah shook her head in panic, begging them not to go in, but David said that they had no choice. They needed shelter and any chance to find a way out. John quietly raised his camera and approached the old door. He gently pushed the door open, and it opened with a screeching sound that made everyone shiver. Inside the hut was dark and covered in thick dust. The musty smell mixed with something like a long-dead corpse. Sarah covered her nose and burst into tears. Michael held a flashlight and shone it everywhere, seeing the walls covered with tattered cloth charms and strange symbols. David walked over to an old wooden table where a tattered notebook with a nearly rotten cover was lying. He opened the yellowed pages, filled with symbols and messy writing. Some pages had red stains like dried blood. John turned the notebook closer, his voice cracking as he said that this was living proof of the true horror stories they were trapped in. In the corner of the room, a wooden cradle lay sprawled. Sarah trembled as she approached and screamed when she saw inside a rag doll with its eyes ripped out and sewn shut with black thread. Michael snatched it and threw it on the ground, but the sound that came out was a hateful screech. The group froze as the door to the hut suddenly slammed shut. The flashlight flickered and then went out. In the thick darkness, a child's sobbing mixed with a soft lullaby could be heard. Sarah fainted in David's arms, while Michael screamed and slashed in the air. John panned the camera in despair and saw small figures walking round them. They whispered each other's names in a high-pitched, drawn-out voice. But when he lowered the camera, there was only absolute darkness. The furniture in the hut shook as if someone was smashing it. David pulled Sarah towards the door and banged on it, hoping it would open. Michael and John used all their strength to break the door. Suddenly, a loud scream shook the whole hut. The door flew open and they rushed out and fell onto the cold, damp ground. They gasped for breath, their hearts pounding. Sarah was still unconscious. David held her tightly in his arms. Michael threw the knife to the ground and screamed in despair. John trembled and checked the camera again, but the screen was full of static. The group decided never to return to the hut again, but the memory of what they had just seen was etched in their minds. This forest was not only about darkness and laughter, it also held the souls of those who had been trapped before. And now they knew for sure that the forest did not want to let them go. It wanted to keep them forever. When night fell again, they huddled around the small fire, trying to fight off their fear. But the lullaby from afar still echoed in the wind. John whispered that if they did not leave this place, they would become part of the ghosts in that hut. Sarah woke up, sobbing and begging to be taken out of here. David held her hand and promised to find a way, but he himself did not believe his own words. Michael sat quietly, his eyes empty as if his soul had been swallowed. That night, no one could sleep, and in their subconscious, they all knew the end was closer than ever. After the haunting night at the cabin, the group decided to try to find a way out once more. They followed the direction that David believed would lead them out of the forest. The weak morning sun filtered through the trees, creating pale streaks of light, but not bringing hope. Sarah walked wearily in David's arms, her eyes still red from crying. Michael walked ahead, swinging the knife to clear the path, while John followed behind with a shaky camera in his hand. At first, they saw a small path leading away. The group cheered in hope, but the joy did not last long. After only a few minutes of walking, the path faded and disappeared completely, leaving only a thick layer of rotting leaves. Sarah panicked and asked why. David tried to reassure them that they might have lost their way, but he was also trembling inside. Michael clenched his knife and swore that the forest was playing tricks on them. John panned the camera and muttered that this was proof of the creepy stories people told. The atmosphere gradually became suffocating. The wind stopped and the birds were completely silent. They heard footsteps following behind them. Michael turned around, but there was only a thick fog. In the hazy fog, silhouettes of people walking parallel to them. Sarah screamed and fell. David quickly caught her. John panned the camera into the fog and whispered that he saw dozens of silhouettes following their footsteps. But when David looked back, there was nothing but a white fog. The deeper they went, the thicker the fog became, reducing visibility to just a few meters. They had to stick close together to avoid getting lost. Whispers echoed in the fog like the voices of dozens of people talking. Sarah covered her ears in panic, but the voices still crept into her head, calling each person's name. David squeezed her hand tightly and pulled her along. Michael shouted loudly for them to stop, but the whispers only turned into shrill laughter. John panned the camera everywhere and said that in the lens he saw distorted faces watching from the fog. Suddenly, Sarah stopped, her eyes wide open. She pointed out in front of her, shaking, saying she saw her house in the fog. David looked, but there was only a hazy white space. Sarah rushed forward, but David held her back. She cried out that her mother was standing there waving. Michael shouted that it was just an illusion the forest had created to lure them. John panned the camera and was horrified to see that the woman was actually standing in the distance smiling. But when he lowered the camera, she was gone. He muttered shakily that the forest was manipulating their minds. Those suns slowly set, the fog still covered the space. They were forced to stop and set up camp. The fire that was difficult to ignite only flickered weakly. Giggles rang out from the thick fog. Blurry shadows passed through the firelight and then disappeared. Sarah sat huddled in David's arms, while Michael clenched his knife. John panned the camera to the white space in front of him. He whispered that he could clearly see dozens of children's faces pressed against the tent, smiling with crooked smiles. But when the group looked out, only the cold fog covered them. That night, they lay awake. Footsteps echoed around the camp, each one heavy. Whispers drifted in and out of their ears. Sarah sobbed, begging to be let out. David held her, but his eyes were empty. Michael sat motionless, sweating coldly. John panned the camera like a man possessed, repeating over and over that the forest would never let them leave. And in that moment, they all knew that the fog not only blocked the path, but also trapped their souls forever. The ninth night ended in a stifling silence. The group sat close together around a small fire that only had a few weak rays of light. Sarah leaned her head on David's shoulder, trembling uncontrollably. Michael held the knife in his hand as his last weapon, while John kept panning the camera, his eyes lost in thought. The fog was so thick that they couldn't see anything beyond a few meters. The whispers, sometimes near, sometimes far, still lingered as if they wanted to penetrate their brains. Every time Sarah closed her eyes, she saw her mother's face smiling in the fog. She cried and begged to stop calling her name, but the voice kept ringing. David tried to stay calm. He hugged Sarah, but his eyes showed despair. Michael turned to him and said that if they sat still, they would slowly die in this forest. They needed to act. John nodded, panned the camera forward, and muttered that the fog wasn't natural, it was part of the trap. As soon as he finished speaking, footsteps sounded right behind them, startling all four of them. Michael swung his knife and turned around, but only saw a white void. A long, lingering chuckle sounded as if teasing them. They decided to try to move forward despite the fog. Each step was heavy, as if drowning in the thick air. Sarah almost fainted. David had to support her step by step. Michael took the lead, continuously slashing his knife into the void, while John turned and whispered a prayer. But then the name was called again. This time it was their own voice. David heard his own voice echoing from the fog, inviting him to go deeper. He stopped, his whole body trembling. Sarah held his hand tightly, begging him not to listen. Michael pulled the group together. shouting not to be manipulated by the fog. 4 of them ran unsteadily until the fog thinned. They stood before an unfamiliar clearing. In the middle was a large, ancient tree with dark bark that gave off a pungent, unpleasant smell. On the trunk were intricately carved, distorted symbols. Sarah screamed when she saw clearly that each of their names was carved on it. David backed away, his face pale. Michael threw the knife to the ground, and John panned the camera, his voice lost, saying that the forest had known of their existence before they set foot in it. No one dared to go near it, but everyone understood that this tree was the center of all hauntings. When night fell, they were forced to take shelter near the tree's base. The fire they had started kept going out as if it had been extinguished by an invisible hand. The sound of footsteps circled around incessantly. Sarah sobbed and begged to go home. David held her in despair. Michael shouted into the darkness, asking what they wanted, but the only response was a distorted laugh. John panned the camera, and suddenly the screen displayed dozens of pale faces pressed against the lens. He panicked and threw the camera to the ground, but when he picked it up, it was only a normal image. The 4 of them sat close together, waiting for each sound. The night seemed endless. Every minute that passed was like a knife cutting into the nerves. When the first light of morning appeared, everyone was exhausted. Sarah slept soundly in David's arms, but her face was still grimacing with fear. Michael was silent as if his soul had been drained. John checked the camera and realized that the tape recorded not only them, but also the strange figures standing behind them throughout the journey. The group understood that they were no longer simply lost people, but had become prey in the game of this forest. And that game had only just begun. The next morning, the sunlight filtered through the mist, but instead of bringing hope, it only revealed the group's bewildered faces. John held the camera shakily and showed everyone the recorded frames. On the tape were not only the 4 of them, but also dozens of shadowy figures standing behind them at each section of the path. Those figures had no faces, just pitch-black shadows with white eyes. Sarah burst into tears, screaming that they had never really walked alone. David held her, but he himself could not stop the trembling that spread throughout his body. Michael gritted his teeth and said that if they let fear take over, they would die in despair. He asked to find a way out of the forest again. The group agreed, although they knew the chances were slim. They began to move in a new direction, hoping that the sun could guide them. But the deeper they went, the more darkness overwhelmed the light. The trees closed in like invisible walls. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, making them turn their heads repeatedly, but still saw nothing. There was only a clear feeling that countless eyes were watching when they reached an open space. They saw an old stone well covered with green moss. The mouth of the well was deep and strangely cold. Sarah shivered and said that she heard a voice calling from the well. David quickly held her back, but the voice became clearer and clearer. Michael shone the flashlight down, but the light could not reach the bottom. John turned the camera in, and a pale face was briefly seen looking up in the lens. He was startled and shouted loudly, causing the whole group to panic and retreat. But when viewed with the naked eye, the well was only a deep darkness. They left the well in extreme fear. The footsteps following behind were now clearer. Occasionally, there was a distorted laughter close to their ears. Sarah fainted, and David had to carry her. Michael muttered a prayer, and John turned and trembled. In the moment he turned the camera back, the whole group was stunned. In the lens, there were rows of silhouettes walking parallel to them. No one could say anything, just running until they were exhausted. When it got dark, they stopped by a rotten tree. They lit a fire but the fire quickly went out as if it was suffocating. Darkness enveloped them, along with murmurs from all sides. John was still filming, his eyes lost in thought. He muttered that if someone found this tape, they would understand that this forest never gives up. Michael held his knife and sat close to the tree. David hugged Sarah, trembling non-stop. Each minute lasted like a century. In the middle of the night, a lullaby sounded from afar, sounding both sad and creepy. Sarah suddenly woke up, her eyes wide open as if hypnotized. She broke free from David's arms and walked towards the darkness. David shouted loudly to hold her back, but she struggled as if someone else was controlling her. Michael and John tried to help, but in the chaos, Sarah collapsed unconscious. The group dragged her back to the tent and sat watching. But the lullaby still echoed, making it impossible for them to sleep when the faint light of dawn shone down again. The group was exhausted, but they knew that the forest was slowly eroding their minds. Not only the calls and shadows, but they themselves were also losing control. John hugged the camera to his chest and whispered that maybe it was all just a sick joke from the other world. But deep down, they all knew that what was happening was the truth, and the truth was so horrifying that no one dared to admit it out loud. The 12th morning began with exhaustion. Sarah lay motionless in David's arms, breathing weakly. Michael was silently sharpening his knife, his eyes wild with sleeplessness. John held the camera like a delirious person. No one said a word, but everyone knew they were no longer in control of themselves. The lullabies still echoed in their heads even when it was morning. Sarah occasionally started to talk in her sleep, repeating incomprehensible words like the lyrics of an ancient song. David looked at Sarah worriedly, then turned to Michael. He said that if they continued, they would lose everything. Michael snapped that there was no way out unless the forest wanted it. John interrupted in a trembling voice that he had reviewed the tape last night and found the silhouette of a woman standing right behind Sarah as she was being dragged away. The silhouette was thin, with long hair covering her face and arms outstretched as if wanting to hug her. Sarah was hypnotized at that moment, and if she had not been pulled back, she would have disappeared forever as they continued to move. The forest became denser, making it difficult for light to penetrate. The air was thick, as if they were entering another dimension. Sarah woke up weakly and said she felt someone whispering in her ear constantly. David tried to calm her down, but he could hear the faint murmuring too. Michael angrily shouted that if they wanted to appear, they could, but the only response was the wind whistling through the leaves. John panned the camera absent-mindedly, and the lens caught a figure standing right in front of him, then disappeared when he lowered the camera. At noon, they reached an unfamiliar clearing. In the middle of the clearing was an old, rotten wooden cross full of torn rag dolls. Sarah burst into tears when she saw one of them had the same hair as her. David hugged her while Michael angrily threw the doll to the ground. But immediately the wind picked up, stirring up dust. The dolls shook as if they were alive. John shot a close-up, trembling, muttering that this was proof of scary animated horror stories that people should not know when it got dark. They were forced to set up a tent right next to the empty land. The fire that had just been lit suddenly went out as if it was extinguished by an invisible hand. Sarah cowered, covering her face, whispering that there was a woman sitting among the dolls. David looked out but saw only an empty space. Michael stood in front of the tent with a knife in his hand. John panned the camera out, and the face of the long-haired woman was clearly visible in the lens. Her hair fell down to cover half her face, her white eyes staring into the tent. He screamed, causing everyone to panic, but when looking directly, there was nothing The lullaby sounded again, this time right outside the tent. Sarah trembled and wanted to rush out, but David held her tight. The singing gradually turned into crying and then into distorted laughter. The tent fabric shook violently as if many hands were clapping. Michael screamed and slashed the knife into the darkness, but only slashed the air. John panned the camera in despair. In the frame, dozens of silhouettes surrounded the tent, faces twisted and laughing. But in reality, all was darkness. They lay awake all night again. Every moment felt like a shackle of the soul. Sarah fainted in David's arms. Michael gasped, his eyes empty. John hugged the camera and sobbed. When dawn broke, they realized they were no longer simply lost. The forest had begun to take them bit by bit, making them part of itself. And they knew in their hearts that the worst was yet to come. As the morning light filtered through the canopy, the group was no longer able to move. Sarah was still unconscious in David's arms, her body cold as if all the life had been sucked out. Michael sat leaning against the tree, his eyes sunken and lifeless. John hugged the camera and kept muttering that it was all just a dream. But every bruise on their hands and every tear on their faces proved otherwise. The forest did not spare anyone. It was like an invisible trap that was tightening. David stood up and tried to reassure the group that they had to move. He did not want to wait another night. Michael reluctantly agreed, but his hoarse voice revealed his exhaustion. John nodded, panning the camera around the scene, then tremblingly followed. Sarah woke up for a moment, then collapsed again, whispering that someone was whispering right in her ear, telling her to stay. David held her tightly, tears welling up in his eyes. But he still tried to pull the group forward. They passed rotten tree trunks with handprints, on the wood as if carved with sharp nails. The air became heavy as if hundreds of eyes were watching. Michael clenched his folding knife, his hand shaking violently. Occasionally, a distorted laugh rang out as if to test their sanity. Sarah gasped and leaned against David's shoulder. John turned the camera back and was stunned when he saw dozens of figures following them in the lens. He shouted, but when David turned back, there was nothing but a thinning mist. The afternoon came unusually quickly. The sky turned ashen grey. They decided to set up camp early because Sarah could not go any further. The fire started and flickered, then died. David shouted loudly for everyone to stay calm, but the wind whistling through the trees turned into creepy laughter. The group crawled into the tent, trembling and hugging each other. Outside, there was the sound of slow footsteps and the sound of the tent being torn. Sarah sobbed and begged not to open it. Michael held his knife, ready to slash anything that came in. John panned the camera and whispered that the tent was shaking as if dozens of hands were pressing from outside. That night, the tent shook violently as if it was about to collapse. The rhythmic tapping sound echoed on the roof of the tent. The shrill laughter mixed with the wailing. Sarah cowered and fainted again. David hugged her with tears streaming down his face. Michael screamed and slashed wildly in the darkness. John panned the camera continuously, the screen showing pale faces pressed against the tent fabric, their lifeless eyes staring at them. He screamed and threw the camera to the ground, but then picked it up again as if he was possessed and forced to record everything. Every minute passed like a century. No one dared to breathe loudly. When the jungle fowl crowed to announce the dawn, the noise gradually subsided. The tent was covered with torn scratches everywhere. Outside, the ground was covered with long, distorted handprints. The group of friends looked at each other with bloodshot eyes from exhaustion and fear. They knew the jungle didn't just want to scare them, it wanted to break their will and make them lost forever. And in that moment, they knew the horror had only just begun. As the weak morning light shone down, the four friends silently looked at each other in exhaustion. The tent was torn and could no longer provide any protection. Sarah was still unconscious in David's arms, her face pale as if it had no life left. Michael sat leaning against the tree, his eyes sunken and lifeless. John held the camera, his hands trembling, but still trying to record every detail. No one said a word because they all understood that with each passing day, they were sinking deeper into a nightmare with no way out. That afternoon, the sky suddenly became heavy. Black clouds gathered to cover the sky. The humid air seemed to signal a heavy rain. But when they looked up, not a single drop fell. Instead, from the forest came the sound of rain falling steadily. Sarah woke up, bewildered, asking why they were still dry even though they heard rain. David silently squeezed her hand. Michael frowned and clenched his knife, while John turned the camera toward the sound. In the lens he saw tiny ripples like rain falling to the ground, but when he put the camera down, everything disappeared. The fake rain sound continued to make them shiver. Along with it was the echoing laughter everywhere. At first it was like a child's laughter, then it turned into a woman's voice, then it turned into a horseman's sound. Sarah held her head and screamed that those voices were whispering her name in the rain. David held her tight, but his eyes also began to crack. Michael shouted loudly into the darkness to show himself, but only heard loud laughter in response. John whispered that the forest was playing a sensory manipulation game, turning every sound into a trapeze. The afternoon wore on the fog thickened again. The rain still fell steadily, but the ground underfoot was still dry. They decided to set up camp under a large tree, hoping to last the night. The fire they lit this time burned brightly, but the echoing rain made the fire flicker as if it was about to go out. Sarah looked into the fog and was startled, saying that she saw a figure sitting in the fake rain. David turned around, but there was nothing but mist. Michael gritted his teeth and slashed the knife into the void, but it only made a whistling sound through the wind. John panned the camera, and the lens clearly showed a group of people standing in the rain, staring. The laughter grew louder. The tent shook violently again. Sarah passed out in David's arms. Michael sat huddled with the knife, sweating profusely. John panned the camera, but the image shook violently. On the screen appeared distorted faces laughing loudly. He shouted and threw the camera down, but the laughter did not stop. Instead, the sound of rain grew louder and louder, drowning out all other sounds. David shouted for everyone to hold on to each other and not let go. The 14th night became an endless night. The sound of fake rain echoed everywhere, while the ground and dry leaves underfoot remained dry. The laughter echoed from the darkness, causing them to lose consciousness. When the first light of dawn appeared, they were left with empty eyes and heavy hearts. They understood that the forest had not only deceived them with images, but now it had also imprisoned them in invisible sounds. And in their subconscious, they all knew that this nightmare had not yet reached its end. The dawn of the 15th day brought no comfort. The sky was grey and heavy, with fog still covering the area. The group of friends sat close together around a small fire, but the fire only flickered weakly as if it was about to go out. Sarah lay in David's arms, breathing weakly and tiredly. Michael sat quietly holding a knife, his eyes bloodshot. John hugged the camera, his eyes lifeless, as if hypnotized. Everyone was exhausted, but did not dare to rest for fear that if they closed their eyes, the forest would swallow them up. The sound of the fake rain had disappeared, replaced by a new melody. A soft lullaby sounded from deep in the forest. The voice, sometimes near, sometimes far, hummed incomprehensible words. Sarah woke up and sang along as if possessed. David shook her in panic, but she did not stop. Michael shouted loudly for her to be quiet. But the singing in the forest became clearer and clearer, in harmony with Sarah's words. John panned the camera into the darkness, and the lens showed a long-haired woman sitting and rocking, her baby in the middle of the clearing. When he lowered the camera, there was only dense fog. The group panicked. David hugged Sarah tightly, begging her to wake up. Michael swung his knife wildly at the empty air, but only hit nothing. John zoomed in on Sarah's face. Seeing her eyes wide open, he screamed, making David even more frantic. Sarah stopped singing for a moment, then collapsed unconscious. The melody in the forest also stopped, leaving only an eerie silence. Everyone held their breaths to listen, but there was no sound other than their pounding hearts. They decided to leave immediately. The group helped each other through the fog, but the lullaby sounded again. This time, it was not one voice, but many voices, harmonizing together like a ghostly choir. Sarah woke up, shaking and crying, begging for mercy. David, almost mad, shouted into the darkness, asking what they wanted. Michael stabbed his knife into the ground, trembling and muttering a prayer. John panned the camera toward the singing and saw dozens of women sitting in a circle holding dolls in their hands. They all raised their heads and sang the lullaby, looking straight into the lens. He shivered and threw the camera to the ground, but the singing continued. That night, they set up their tent under a large tree. The cold wind whistled through the leaves, creating a creepy sound. The lullaby continued to ring as if it surrounded the entire forest. Sarah covered her ears and screamed, but she could still hear it. David hugged her, tears streaming down his face. Michael clenched his knife in his hand, his eyes red with anger. John turned on the camera again, and their tent was surrounded by countless pale faces singing. He screamed and begged them to stop, but nothing changed. The group stayed up all night again. When dawn broke, they sat motionless, as if they had lost their souls. Sarah put her head on David's shoulder, still whispering the melody of the lullaby. David hugged her, but his eyes were empty. Michael growled that the forest didn't want them to escape, but wanted to make them part of it. John shook his head and nodded, saying that everything they were experiencing was a living, terrifying creepypasta, and they know that this is not the end of their fear. As the morning light faded into a gloomy afternoon, the four friends were forced to stop. Sarah lay curled up in David's arms, occasionally humming a meaningless lullaby as if under control. Michael sat motionless, his eyes bloodshot, clutching the knife as his last hope. John quietly checked the camera and whispered that the footage from last night showed dozens of figures surrounding the tent. Everyone was silent for a long time. Then David stood up and said that they needed to set up camp before it got completely dark. The fire they had lit flickered weakly in the wind. Sarah woke up and stared into the fire with lifeless eyes. She whispered that the forest wanted them to stay forever. David held her close and begged her to stop talking. Michael sat nearby and said in a harsh voice that if the forest wanted them, they would at least fight. John panned the camera toward the darkness and said with a trembling voice that there were faces staring out of the mist. But when the group turned back, there was only a dense void. Night fell quickly. The sound of fake rain echoed again, but this time accompanied by a creepy laugh. Blurry figures appeared at the edge of the light and then disappeared. Sarah cowered, trembling, and David held her tightly, tears streaming down his face. Michael stood in front of the tent, his hands shaking. John panned the camera, and the lens clearly saw tall, thin figures circling the camp. When he lowered the camera, everything disappeared. The footsteps continued to circle endlessly. Suddenly, the fire went out, and darkness engulfed everything. Sarah screamed and fell. David hugged her, and Michael swung his knife in despair. John panned the camera again, and in the faint pink light on the screen, dozens of pale faces surrounded her. Empty eyes stared. He screamed and threw the camera down, but the distorted laughter still echoed in his ears. The group huddled together in the tattered tent, listening to the creepy, scratching sound echoing everywhere. Time seemed to stop. Each minute felt like an hour. Sarah fainted, David sobbed and hugged her tightly. Michael gasped and kept mumbling a plea. John cowered, picked up the camera and held it to his chest, as if clinging to a piece of reality. When dawn broke, they sat there, eyes sunken, as if they had lost all their vitality. No one dared to say a word, but everyone knew that this camping trip had turned into a nightmare with no way out, and the deep forest seemed to have only just begun to reveal its true nature. The morning of the 17th was heavier than any other day before. Sarah lay unconscious in David's arms, occasionally muttering as if talking to someone invisible. Michael quietly sharpened his knife, his eyes bloodshot and lifeless. John held the camera tightly as if it were the only thing keeping him from going crazy. No one had the strength to talk anymore, just sat silently listening to the sounds of the surrounding forest. But in that silence, a new sound began to echo from underground. At first it was just a soft murmur, then gradually turned into a call of each person's name. David bent down, put his ear to the ground, then turned pale and immediately backed away. He whispered that there were voices right below their feet. Sarah opened her eyes white, and whispered that the spirits were inviting her down to join them. Michael angrily shouted for everyone not to listen, but the whispering grew louder and louder, as if hundreds of voices were speaking at once. John panned the camera toward the ground, and in the lens he saw blurry hands reaching out from small cracks in the earth and rock. He shouted loudly, causing everyone to panic and retreat. But when they put down the phone, only the cold ground remained. They decided to leave that place quickly, but the echoes still followed. Each step echoed like a beat from the ground. Sarah began to sob, begging to be let down because there was peace there. David desperately hugged her, crying and praying. Michael screamed that the forest was trying to swallow them from above and below. John panned the camera back to each person's face, seeing the fear had turned to despair. When they reached another clearing, the ground had large cracks that emitted a cold air. The echoes echoed louder. The voices now turned into painful screams, like those of imprisoned souls. Sarah suddenly broke free from David's arms and ran towards the cracks. David shouted loudly to hold her back. Michael and John also rushed to help. They pulled her back in desperation while the ghostly hands rose up and tried to touch her feet. The group struggled in panic until they finally pulled Sarah away. Immediately, the screams stopped, leaving only a terrifying silence. The night fell. The sky was pitch black without moon or stars. They did not dare to set up camp near the crack, but moved to a large tree. But the echoes from the ground still echoed far and wide. The fire they lit quickly died out, leaving behind a dim light. Sarah lay panting in David's arms, but her lips were still moving as if she was talking to someone. Michael held the knife, his eyes wild. John panted again, and the screen showed distorted faces pressed against the transparent soil. He trembled and threw the camera down, but then picked it up again because he could not stop filming. All night they sat close together, listening to the whispering sounds under their feet. Every time someone tried to close their eyes, they heard the voice of a deceased relative calling them. David heard his father's voice, Sarah heard her mother's voice, Michael heard his sister's voice, and John heard his best friend's voice. They all trembled, torn between fear and the desire to believe. But deep down they knew that it was not their loved ones, but the forest that held countless souls and used them as bait. When dawn came again, the four friends sat down on the ground, exhausted. They were no longer afraid of the darkness or the lullaby, but now the earth itself had become a prison. And in the faint light of morning, they knew that each next step would only bring them closer to the abyss from which there was no return. The morning of the 18th came with a heavy heaviness. No one in the group could sleep. Sarah sat leaning against David. Her eyes were blank and lifeless, her lips still moving as if she was conversing with someone. Michael sat not far away, his pocket knife shaking with each breath. John hugged the camera and stared at the ground as if afraid that at any moment a new hand would rise up. David tried to stay calm, but his heart was pounding. The echoes from the ground had stopped, but the haunting was still there. They decided to continue walking despite their lack of strength. The deep forest was getting thicker and thicker. The sunlight was almost completely blocked. The atmosphere was thick with a musty smell. Sarah muttered that she saw her mother waiting ahead. David held her hand tightly, begging her not to listen. Michael screamed that it was all a trap. John panned the camera and whispered that in the lens he saw familiar figures smiling and calling them. But when they lowered the camera, there were only cold, rotten tree trunks at noon. They came to a small lake with a surface as calm as a mirror. Sarah approached and looked down and screamed. The reflection of the water did not reflect her image, but the face of a woman with long hair and white eyes. David pulled her away, but immediately the lake's surface stirred up. A series of hands appeared and then disappeared. Michael shivered and held the knife tightly while John panned the camera to record the gruesome scene. He whispered that these were true stories that no one outside would believe, until they saw it with their own eyes. The afternoon sky darkened unusually quickly. A distorted laugh echoed everywhere. Sarah trembled and said that someone was walking alongside her in the darkness. David looked around but saw nothing. Michael quickly stepped forward, muttering a prayer. John panned the camera to the left and screamed in panic. In the lens, there was a long line of figures standing motionless in the middle of the forest, all turned to look straight at them. When he put down the camera, there was nothing but a thick white mist. He burst into tears and said that they could no longer distinguish between truth and falsehood. The 18th night fell with the lullaby playing again. Sarah was almost insane as she kept wanting to rush out to follow the voice. David hugged her tightly, tears falling down. Michael sat in front of the tent, clutching his knife, his eyes empty. John panned the camera and clearly saw a long-haired woman standing right next to Sarah, whispering in her ear. He trembled and begged David to hold her tight. Sarah fainted and then fell silent in David's arms. The lullaby turned into sobbing and then stopped, leaving behind thick darkness. The group stayed awake all night again. They sat silently in endless fear. The experiences they had just witnessed were beyond imagination. No one could deny it anymore. This forest really held countless souls and was gradually turning them into a part of it. When dawn broke, the four of them looked at each other with bewildered eyes. They understood that survival was only a slim hope, and in their hearts, they all knew that the end was near. The morning of the 19th came without any hope. Sarah lay in David's arms, her face haggard as if it were just a shadow. Michael sat silently on the ground, his hands still clutching the knife, but his eyes were lifeless. John held the camera close to his chest, occasionally shaking as he turned the lens into the darkness. No one said a word to each other because they all knew that their time was running out. The forest was slowly swallowing each person's soul. They decided to try to move forward one more time, hoping that they could find a way out. But just a few hours later, the atmosphere around them suddenly changed. The wind stopped, the sound of birds disappeared, and instead, screams echoed from all directions. At first, it was just a distant echo, but gradually became clearer, each sound as if right in their ears. Sarah woke up, her eyes white, screaming loudly along with the sound. David held her tightly, but he himself was trembling uncontrollably. Michael staggered to his feet, knife in hand raised. He shouted loudly, asking the forest what it wanted. Immediately, a piercing scream rang out in response, making the group's ears hurt. John panned the camera and saw countless distorted faces with their mouths open, screaming like hundreds of imprisoned souls. He panicked and fell to the ground, screaming that these were revenge stories of the forest. Those souls were betrayed and abandoned, and now they wanted to drag more people down with them. The screams grew louder and louder, resounding so loudly that the ground shook. Sarah cried out, begging to follow the voice. David desperately hugged her, tears streaming down. Michael screamed and slashed his knife at the ground, but it didn't change anything. John frantically panned the camera everywhere, but the frame was filled with screaming faces approaching. The group cowered as if they wanted to disappear in that terrible sound. Night came and no one had the strength to set up a tent. They sat down in the middle of the open ground, their ears ringing from the endless screams. The thick darkness came and swallowed the last light. Sarah was unconscious in David's arms, occasionally letting out a painful cry. Michael sat motionless, his eyes bloodshot. John hugged the camera and sobbed, muttering that no one out there would believe what they had been through. As the hours ticked by, the screams became whispers. Voices repeated that they would never escape. The forest would swallow them, turning them into a vengeful echo. The group held each other in desperation, trembling, waiting for the dawn. But deep down, they knew that tomorrow's light might not come to them again. And if it did, it might not bring the same hope as before. The last night fell with an unusual silence. No more lullabies, no more screams, just a cold silence like death. Sarah lay in David's arms, her eyes closed, her face pale. He softly called her name, but only received a weak breath. Michael sat a few steps away, knife still in hand, but his head was bowed to his shoulder, breathing heavily. John held the camera close to his chest, trembling, whispering that if anyone found this recording, they would know the truth. The cold wind blew through the forest, creating a long, wailing sound. The group huddled together, their eyes empty. David looked up at the sky, but saw only pitch blackness without a single star. He knew that tomorrow would never come. Sarah opened her eyes one last time, whispered that her mother was waiting for her, then held David's hand tightly before falling silent. His tears fell uncontrollably. Michael burst into tears, but his screams disappeared into the darkness. John panned the camera one last time, capturing each person's face, eyes filled with fear and resignation. Then, from the darkness, the shadows appeared again. They were no longer hidden, but stepped out clearly, surrounding the group. Dozens of pale faces with empty eyes approached. David hugged Sarah tightly and screamed in despair. Michael swung his knife and rushed in, but was immediately pulled down by invisible hands. John screamed and panned the camera everywhere to record every last moment. The shadows tightly surrounded him. The light from the last fire suddenly extinguished. The darkness swallowed everything. The scream echoed and then disappeared, leaving only a terrifying silence. The camera fell to the ground, the screen still flashing, recording a blurry image. In the frame, 4 backpacks lay scattered on the edge of the forest. The tattered tent and the fire had died down. The silhouettes of his friends were no longer there. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the treetops like the whisper of the forest kept them forever. Many years later, someone happened to pass by the forest and found the old camera. In it, there was a tape recording of distorted laughter, lullabies, and screams. But the end was just an empty image of the deep forest and the sound of the wind. No one knew where the 4 friends went or what really happened. But since then, no one dared to set foot in this forest again. And the story of that camping trip became one of the scary that people whispered to each other forever.